this is about the outline. Let's go on. This is a little self-introduction, but that's no longer needed. Terminology. I'm not a linguist, so often I use the terminology of Unicode. It has the advantage that it's established in one place, but it doesn't always match the terminology used by a linguist, so please be careful. Also, my main interest is in the interaction between encoding and writing. Encoding as a substrate for writing, of course, with present-day technology. Encoding and surrounding technologies also as a medium for writing, similar to tortoise shells, papers and brush, and so on. And research on writing is crucial for good encoding. And encoding may also influence thinking about writing. Okay, this is the start of the real core of the talk. In the study of writing system, many people distinguish between graphemics and graphetics with the units of grapheme and graph. In technology, there's a similar distinction between character and glyph. And the areas there are encoding, in particular, of course, Unicode and font technology. And here we have some examples of a letter B, grapheme B, with many different instantiations. Now, in 2009, Oliver Resnick published his PhD. It has a very long title. This is just a short form of the title, zur Struktur des deutschen Schriftsystems. He proposed an intermediate level here between grapheme and graph, namely what we called Grundform, or in English, basic shape. And the idea is that if you have a G, it doesn't work for the B, it only has one basic shape, but if you have a G, then you have a 2-story G and a 3-story G, and they have different shapes. Yeah, it's clearly a distinction that is not gradual, like here, where you can just have a little thicker, a little thinner, a little bit more of a serif, or something like that. Okay. So then Yannis asked me, well, what about Han characters? Does this apply to Han characters? How does it apply? And I also added to that, then of course, what about encoding? I have to admit that I haven't found the full answer for this, but I hope to tell you in this talk a little bit of what I found and what directions that we have to look for further. Okay. Han characters, I hope you know them. By the way, the main character in Han, kanji, is also the character used in Wuhan, which is quite famous now, which wasn't really known until the start of this year, unfortunately. Okay. In Unicode, they are called Han ideographs. But a reviewer has told me to avoid that term, so I'll try hard. Okay, let's look at an example. This is just a few glyphs taken out of the ISO equivalent of Unicode. If we look at these, then we can, let me see this. We can see that, for example, here we have a, here we have a single dot, whereas, for example, here we have 2 dots, yeah? And then here we have a straight line, but here we have a zigzaggy line, yeah? And then also, here we have a horizontal bar. This bar here is slightly slanted. It goes from top right to bottom left. And then also here we have just an end, and here we have a little hook at the end. So what does all this mean? What does all this mean? If we look at the, no, I have to switch it off. No, and now go to the next page. We see that the horizontal, what is this? Did I stop? I somehow stopped sharing, no? Am I sharing now or not? Okay, I'm back where I want to be. Okay, so what we see here is that all these characters with a horizontal line at the top, they all these glyphs, they are all the same character. And then we have another character here and another character here, and they each have their code and their reference to different codes and different national regional standards. On the other hand, here we have this part here varies for each of the these national versions of the characters, but they nevertheless get the same code point, the same number. Yeah. Why is that? Because this bottom left part, the part here, the bottom left part is widely used in many other characters. For example, in Japanese, grade school and second grade students already learn 4 of these characters of this part, whereas the top right part here, that is actually, if you look at it individually, it's different characters, and so it's easy to guess that these 3 different groups of glyphs are also different characters. Okay, then, now what I did, I have to do clear all, okay. And then, okay, so now this is an example where we saw that the basic shapes, they work. We have different basic shapes, but still it's the same grapheme, it's the same character. So, and the encoding works is for characters and not for something else. But now let's go to a talk that, although I missed it because of a flight delay, a talk at the last conference by Wilhelm Küster, which has impressed me quite a bit. His topic was closed and open writing systems. He introduced a distinction of writing systems into closed and open. And it's very simple. Closed writing systems are small with a consensus on what signs you need and so on. And changes are very rare. And open writing systems are large, essentially open sets of signs. The number is unclear and additions are possible. Now, Han is definitely an open writing system, and I started to analyze the forces of Han openness. The first force is morphemic writing. The characters are essentially morphemes. If you need, the need for new characters is rare these days, but it can happen. For example, new chemical elements get their own characters in Chinese. And this increases the number of characters. This is now, we already have a lot of them, so we don't many more. But if you look at the case for new emoji, you can imagine that at the start of writing, there was a very similar thing. Yeah? You had a character for elephant, and you wanted one for hippopotamus, and so on, like with emoji these days. Anyway, so that's the start. But then we have other things. There's a long history and widespread use, which adds to the numbers. One example is that kokuji in Japanese, a character for pass, a character for to work, which were not available in Chinese, and so on. And it also increases the number of variants. Then the next thing is writing media. Different writing media also increase the number of variants. And then the core really is the huge number of characters that you have. And the one thing that happens there is openness means that numbers feed numbers. Because you have so many, you get more. How do you get more? One reason, for example, is the long tail distribution. You have a set of frequently used characters, although that's way less frequent than Latin letters, for example. But then you have characters that get used extremely rarely. And that means that people don't remember them and are not sure whether something is a character, and that leads to mistakes. This is an example of a mistake in the basic Japanese standard. This character never existed. It was kind of created into the standard because of a mistake. So these kind of clerical transcription mistakes happen not only in old times, they happen also quite recently. Then the next force is decomposability. To alleviate the cognitive load of having to memorize all these characters and having to understand how to draw them and so on, composition is used. This is very similar for example, in Egyptian, you have Egyptian quadrats. Maya writing is also very similar. Hangul comes to mind here. Hangul is much more regular than the others, but anyway. And this, on the other hand, it makes things easier to remember, but it makes it also easier to create new ones. Then if you have many of these, some of them tend to be quite complex, because if everything is simple, you don't have enough different shapes. Here's an example of the biang noodles. If you go to Wikipedia, you'll see that this character there actually has 17 different variants on top of it, yeah? And this, in turn, the high complexity in turn creates needs for simplifications. And so the consequences of Han openness is that you have a large number of phenomena, large number of things going on. You have lots of rules that usually it's like this, but these are combined with a lot of exceptions. If you're interested, you should definitely look at Ken Lunde's list of strange Han characters, where he just collects things that don't really match the standard pattern. And you have large number of reasons for variation. You have a huge number of variants. You have a large degree of variation, and you have end up with various technologies for handling variants. Okay, then next, well, what's the purpose of variation? You have writing implements, language region differences, traditional versus simplified. That applies to Chinese, but also to Japanese. You have name variants, in particular in Japan. You have scribal variations. That's important for historians. You have the inscription as the example that we have already seen. No longer so important, but 20, 30 years ago, that was definitely an issue. We had variants for low display resolution, because with a 16 by 16 pixel font, you can't just display every character perfectly. And in the end, you also have pronunciation variants. This is an example of the same character, the same look, encoded 3 times, because the Koreans did that because this character has 3 different pronunciations. And at one point, they thought it would be a good idea to encode this like that. Turns out it doesn't really work, because if you just look at the character, you don't really know how to read it. Okay, the degree of variation, I made a little bit of a list here of examples from major variations to minor variations. This first here, the character for body, is really, there's no direct relationship between the traditional and the simplified, except that all of these parts in some way you can think, well, okay, it relates somehow, somewhere to body. On top of that, there are a bunch of others that also are variants of this character. At the bottom, you have really very minor things, just the question whether a line is attached or not, or whether it's straight or horizontal or vertical. And these are all examples with separate co-points, so they're separately encoded. Okay, now let's go back to basic shapes. Traditional and simplified variants, for example, can be seen as basic shapes of the same grapheme. But, well, is that really true? How should we think about this? They are not really freely substitutable, yeah, because simplification level, the level of simplification should be uniform. You cannot just mix and match simplified and traditional characters. Then how do basic shapes relate to Han unification and subsumption? Han unification is the process of taking the national standards and checking, well, which of these characters encoded in, for example, the Japanese and the Chinese and so standards are essentially the same. Subsumption works inside a national standard or any other kind of standard to look at examples and say, are these the same or not? Yeah. And the idea there is that minor differences are merged. These are examples. This is, for example, a character for bone. And this is a character that we have just looked at a moment ago. And these differences are too small because it's essentially the same character. And so they are only encoded once. But you have to be careful. There is a caveat. If the minor difference is actually significant, like here, the character for big, the character for dog, and the character for fat, these are totally different characters, and so you may need to make sure that you encode them separately. Yeah. And there's also another exception for legacy encodings. On the other hand, major differences in the Unicode standard, they're called differences in abstract shape, are encoded separately, even if they are only variants. Okay, so what's interesting is to note that the target of Han encoding in the modern standards is the average use by average user, the average use in average text, yeah? It means that it's for non-specialized use. It's not for specialized use. So for example, the discussion about Han unification or the discussion of historical scribal variants or the discussion of details in font design cannot claim to need characters encoded. Yeah? And it's not for novice users. For example, the example with dog and fat and so, you need to know these. These are fairly easy ones, but you need a certain knowledge. But it's also not for highly educated specialists. It's not that you need to know really a lot to be able to use the encoding. Then one place where we have basic shapes is in components. If you look at these characters here, if you look at the second one here, you have essentially two shapes that get combined into one, but one of these, the left part, this lower, my cursor is too big to show it. The lower right arm is a bit smaller than for the right part. And then also here for the heart radical, it changes shape if it's in this position. But these are not basic shapes for characters. Okay. So also basic shapes and font design, this needs more research. And here's a list of technologies available for variants and to some extent also basic shapes. If we see that, we have characters, we have compatibility characters, we have ideographic variant sequences, we have ideographic description sequences, and then there is language to describe these characters. And there's also font technology that can be accessed, for example, from something like the Glyph wiki, which is really amazing if you go and look at it. Okay, my conclusions up to here are the openness of Han produces a very large variety of shapes and relationships, and it may not be possible to summarize all of this as basic shapes, and definitely further research is still needed. Okay, with that, I'm sorry to that I went over time, but I would be very glad to accept some questions. Except that I have to, where's the chat part?
Thank you very much for that very nice talk. You put some structure on a very vast topic. I have a question by Gordian Schreiber.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the notion of variance, and you showed it on the slide 22. And I was wondering how this notion of variant would relate to the bipartite division between characters on the one hand and the glyphs on the other hand. So can we say that variants are glyphs basically? And the second question would then be how to determine these variants or maybe glyphs as such. So how do we know that a character is merely a variant of another character, or if it's a separate character altogether?
Well, to know whether it's a variant or not, you have to look at the example texts, and this is not what I have done, but there's a lot of data about that around. You have lists of explicit simplifications, for example. All of these are explicit simplifications here. This is just, well, people know that these are just variants of each other. You research the reading of each of the characters, you research the usage and so on, yeah. So that's it. Here in the middle, especially these 4 examples, they turn up a lot in names. Virtually every class of about 100 students I get every year, there are 1 or 2 or 3 students which have one of these variants and not the other, which would be fine, except that then they, in some of the computer systems, one of the variants turn up, and in another place, the other variant turns up. And then if you do the grading, processing, and so on, you have to make sure you connect the dots there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe just a quick follow-up on this.
Yeah.
Can we say that the variants are glyphs of one more abstract character?
There's definitely something like a character glyph, a grapheme glyph relationship going on, but on the level of the encoding, for example, all of these, the right side and the left side, they have separate codes, yeah, because they're up to the last one, they're considered to, or maybe up to the two last ones, they're considered to be actually different. For example, here the place of this mountain part is different. The structure is different. Here the components are different. Here the components are also different, and so on. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that in terms of actual writing, the G examples, for example, from Resnick, you can really write the text with one G or the other, and it doesn't bother anybody. They will just read over it. Whereas here in these examples, in some cases, if it's not names especially, people might just say, what the hell? Why does this variant turn up here? So it's a question of whether this is really, or to what extent it's an allogram, and you can look at it as the same grapheme.
Thank you. A question by James Myers.
Just a quick question. I know you're not thinking this way, but presumably there's some correct answer for what this level would be, but the answer might depend on what your goals are. So if you want to understand psycholinguistically how readers and writers conceptualize the characters, there might be a way to test some sort of experiment to find out what people actually use at this level. If you want to just describe descriptively how the system is structured, you could do some sort of machine learning to find the ideal representation. Have you, I know you probably haven't thought about this at all, but maybe you can try now to think about it for a second.
Well, let me go. Yeah, the question is, so, well, are there basic shapes in Han ideographs? And if yes, where are they? It doesn't necessarily, as you point out, it doesn't necessarily have a single answer. Maybe there's concepts similar to basic shapes, but there's not just one such concept, but a few of them. And we don't know yet how many. And maybe it's a hierarchy, as in Resnick's case, or maybe it's the structure is a little bit more complex. And definitely also, it would be good to get actual, I mean, data from encoding data from databases is easy to get, but it would be very interesting to get data from actual experiments, how people are looking at these. For that, just one example, these two characters, that was quite a time ago, but I did occasionally show these to my students. And if you just show one, they say, oh, that's the character for bone. If you show the next one, they say, oh, that's the character for bone. And then if you show both side by side, they would look at them and say, oh, which one is the right one? Oh, this is right, and this is kind of strange, yeah? So you get effects like this.
That's interesting. Yeah, this study has been done on the lowercase g issue. People have looked at that. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
And a last question by Mark Kuster.
Oh, I'm very glad to get a question from you.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. For me, it's actually really a compelling case, again, that the character glyph distinction in some points of view can be simplistic in that it really depends on the concrete point of view. how would you apply a similar logic to the one that you have used for Han for other open writing systems, especially historic ones, so like the cuneiform writing system, for example?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not very familiar with the cuneiform or anything like that, but I think one thing is that I showed this, where do we have that? It's really related. Yeah, this one, average use by average user for Han characters, that's very important because they're really in daily use. Yeah. Now for cuneiform, the main users are really the specialists, and so the focus can be a bit different, but that's about as much as I can say. Yeah.
So you think it could be possible to do something roughly similar according to these rules, but obviously adapted to the specific setting of these type of dead scripts, which are really used in a scholarly setting primarily?
Well, I think that people working on encoding of cuneiform have definitely thought very hard about certain examples of, is this the same underlying character, the underlying grapheme, or is this something different? And if it's the same, but it looks different, then what should we do about it? But my guess is also that in terms of numbers, I'm not sure, but I think cuneiform is still overall, there are less characters, quite a bit less, maybe an order of magnitude less or so than for Han. So that also plays a role, I think.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your talk.
Good morning, everybody. The title of my talk is Between Characters and Glyphs, the Case of Han Characters. And well, I hope to meet in Paris, but we are actually meeting on the internet. My name is Martin Dürst, and I'm from University. Okay,